Today, I am so pleased to welcome Professor Erin Dej to the Ending Homelessness Will This Be Done podcast. Dr. Dej has long worked with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, is professor of criminology at Wilfred Laurier University in Canada, author of the wonderful book Complex Exile, Homelessness and Social Exclusion in Canada, a new and interesting new documentary, Bridging Divides, dozens of important and interesting academic articles on a wide variety of topics in homelessness. Too much for us to get into today. A lot of impressive work. One thing I love about your work is the focus on collaboration. My only regret is I know we're only going to have time to touch on a few of the things you've been doing today. But so welcome, Dr. Dej. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's truly an honor to get to talk to you about these things. You inspired a lot of my work, so it's so wonderful to be able to chat with you about my research.
So let me start out with my standard question. How is it you came to do this work? Why do it? Out of all the possible things one can do with their life, why focus on homelessness? Why do it in academia? I spent a lot of my time today trying to convince students not to go to grad school in academia. And why so much collaborative work? What is it you hope to accomplish by doing this?
Yeah, actually, the answer is one and the same. So I don't have lived experience of homelessness. This isn't something that I come to based on personal experience. So I very much came to it from an academic perspective. And I was starting my PhD and trying to figure out what my PhD might look like. And actually, at the time, my dad was the chaplain of a shelter in the city that we're from. And I was getting a ride home from him. So I would go into the shelter and wait for him to be done for the day so I could get a drive home. And I was standing in the hallway waiting for him, and there was a bulletin board there, and that's where I saw this poster say, are you tired? Are you irritable? Are you having trouble concentrating? You might have depression, and come see us in our medical office. And I just thought, well, if I was living in a shelter, sleeping with, in this case, this shelter is only about 8 people in a room, but other shelters are, 12, 24, or 50 people in a room. I would probably be pretty irritable. I would probably have trouble concentrating. I probably wouldn't be sleeping very well. Does it mean I have depression? I mean, maybe, but maybe it's the conditions that I'm living in that cause me to be that way. And so that's what really got me down the path of being interested in how mental health is shaped in the homelessness sector. And then from there, I got to spend time with and become friends with lots of folks who have lived experience of homelessness. And that's where I really came to see how much I don't know and how much I need to value listening to people with lived experience of homelessness. And so all of my research from then on has been done in collaboration with lived experts because they know it better than I ever will. I want to use academia to put them in leadership positions as much as possible.
That's what I often say too. Is when I was 22 and 23, first started working in a homeless shelter, I knew everything. But then I quickly learned that there wasn't much that I know. And the older I get, the more I don't know.
That's right. Absolutely.
So if we hope to end homelessness, we need to do more to prevent it, obviously, which is odd because so many of the interventions focus on governing homeless people, managing homelessness, rather than trying to prevent it. And one of the things I love about the work you started doing, you've been doing consistently for about a decade now, is the thought that's gone into doing just that. How do we prevent people from becoming homelessness rather than managing people once they become unhoused? So this focus on managing, fixing, governing individualized subjects happen to be homeless is what you refer to as a homelessness industrial complex, right? In your book, Complex Exile. Can you describe what you did for the book in terms of the research and what you mean by this homelessness industrial complex? Why that well-meaning approach is destined not to prevent or end homelessness? It's a long question, but
it's a long question. But again, I'm an academic, so I came up with a fancy term to describe what actually lots of folks in the sector already knew and know. So the Homelessness Industrial Complex and the book A Complex Exile came from my doctoral research. So the research I did from that shelter where I saw that poster come about, and as I did the research, interviewing 38 people with lived experience of homelessness, focus groups with professionals, I really tried to understand, first of all, how mental health narratives are being shaped in the homelessness sector, but it also gave me a real understanding of the sector itself. I did, I believe, 240 hours of participant observation, just spending time in different shelters and getting to know people and seeing how the whole thing works. And what I came to see is, I got to be around both people who were experiencing homelessness and the people working in the field, some of the kindest, most compassionate, most resilient people that I've ever met. And at the same time, they were all in many ways being boxed in a variety of ways. And so that's what the term homelessness industrial complex is trying to get at. The ways that the various systems and investments, what we fund and what we don't fund, and also the way we talk about it, what marketing campaigns are going to be palpable to solicit much needed donations from many of these not-for-profits, how all of that is creating the lanes that these organizations or this advocacy work is allowed to stay in. And when you deviate from that lane, when you don't stay in your own lane, that's where there isn't space for that. There isn't space for kind of those radical imagining of what a systems change would look like. And so the lane that the homelessness industrial complex creates is really one about individualizing homelessness. And again, I lean so much into your own work, Vin, to think through about how this individualization happens. But generally speaking, the idea is to try to change the systems, the economic structures, the social structures that are creating the level of the crisis that we have today would be big, and it's daunting and it's overwhelming. What feels and seems manageable is fixing the individual.
Right.
As if there's something to be fixed in the first place. And so that really constrains us in what we're doing and what we're investing in. And so that's what the homelessness industrial complex is really getting at. And I see it all the day, and I'm complicit in it myself. I'm on the boards of directors for shelters. I do advocacy campaigns, and I see where I feel forced to speak a particular narrative without trying to think through the structural change. To the other piece of your question, that's where prevention comes in. And we are seeing some shifts in that direction. Prevention is stepping outside that box, is saying, well, what if we move beyond the homelessness sector to stop homelessness before it even starts? The tricky bit with homelessness prevention done well is it actually involves sectors that are not doing things that they would consider homelessness prevention.
Right.
That's affordable childcare. That's income equality. That's anti-discrimination policies. I would say in the United States, that would be things around healthcare coverage, things like that. So that's not explicitly homelessness prevention, but if those things are taken care of, people will be able to stay in their homes and not have to suffer the trauma of experiencing homelessness in the first place.
Or returning the land and giving land autonomy back to those people.
Absolutely.
Might be an effort, but nobody thinks about that as a step towards homelessness.
That's right.
Now, while you were talking, you reminded me of a story when I was working in a shelter in Massachusetts. And I think you're right. It's not the people, we don't want to think of the shelter workers as like ill-informed or misguided. People are really working hard. They're doing the best that they can do within what's the allowable conditions. But we were there, and there was a shelter with about 23 people could stay there. There was waiting lists every night of people calling, and it's just so daunting. It's worse for the person who can't get in. But if you're a staff member and it's like 40 people on the waiting list, it's just so depressing.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
And so the staff were like, well, what should we do? So we decided, a couple of us went on a local radio station and put out a call for tents to be donated. And what was the response? Some people donated tents, and local politicians also called up the people who ran the shelter and said, get your staff in order. Put them back in their lane, because they're supposed to be fixing people, not bringing attention to the fact that we don't have enough space for people. And that's all we were looking for, was a tent for somebody to sleep in.
Yeah.
There was literally threats to cut the funding, the little funding we had. And there's never enough of that either for people. But
yeah.
And the prevention, the mental health issue is a curious one, I think. Depression, anxiety, who doesn't have that, right? It's just so widespread. And don't we want to look at some point, if we want to think about prevention, what's going on in these societies where so many people are feeling these symptoms of depression and anxiety? isn't that a symptom of something else going on structurally rather than just something within their brain?
Absolutely. And I think that is true also of the homelessness crisis overall as well. I know there's some people who actually say we shouldn't be using the word crisis anymore because it's too intentional and too long term. I still think it's a crisis. I just think I still think the word crisis is useful, but recognizing that this is now a multi-decades long issue, and something I often talk about is since then, especially in the 1990s, especially since then, there are too many people experiencing homelessness at this point for it to be just bad decisions or laziness or whatever, stereotypes people might have. The common denominator is too big for it to be individual choices at that point. Too many people are experiencing homelessness for that to be it. There has to be something else bigger going on to explain the huge upshot in the homelessness population since the 1990s. So, all you have to do is look at the evidence to see, what happened in the 1990s that we've completely seen a transformation for the worse in our homeless population.
No, that's when I teach classes, I teach about that when I started doing this work, in the 1990s, a long time ago, this feeling sort of was that this was a crisis. And we're
Hmm.
going to do this emergency work in the shelters and stuff to keep people alive until the crisis passes. Now it's 4 decades later. It's a condition that's become just a normal feature of life in so many Western nations. How did that come to be? How's it become so acceptable that's not even thought of as a crisis any longer?
If you look at the histories of a lot of the shelters will either there'll be like a handful of shelters that, began in like 1906 or 1910, like really,
Right.
or they began in the 90s. Like I have very rarely found shelters that opened in the 60s or the 70s. It's either they were small shelters that were managing, that were what we call three hots and a cot, from back in the day when it was mostly,
Yeah.
single men traveling from city to city looking for work. And then the crisis hit. And I think part of the reason we're at the level of the crisis we are now is exactly what you just said. In the 90s, the level of the crisis upshot so quickly, like relatively speaking from a policy perspective, that people were, well, what do we have to work with? We have these, kind of old shelters designed for predominantly white men. We're just going to keep doing more of that because all of a sudden we have lineups outside the door and we don't know how to help everybody. And so I think it's taken the sector a really long time, and they're continuing to work on that to recognize and adapt to the diversity now in the homeless population. So we have way more women and gender diverse people, racialized people, people with disabilities, young people who are experiencing homelessness. And the emergency shelter system that was designed 100 plus years ago wasn't designed for them. And when these spaces aren't designed for them, then they're not welcome, then they don't feel safe. And then we have, increase in, unsheltered homelessness and increase in a lack of safety for particular populations. So that's part of the story too, is I think it was the speed at which the crisis came to be that left people no time to think, what's the best way to respond? It was just, oh my goodness, we have to respond. And I think we've been now for decades trying to undo maybe that quick response to see, well, what actually should we be doing? And prevention, I think, is part of that story.
Well, get back to prevention 1 second. In the 60s and 70s, what we had was nations that were benefiting from the post-World War II expansion, Keynesian economies that had taken off, the fact that, the war situated a couple places like Canada and the US that were separated from the battlefield economically well, and they were doing really well, right? And there was also sort of an expansion of welfare policies
That's
during
right.
that time.
Yeah.
And then you came up with neoliberalism, right? And the neoliberal capitalism takes over and produces homelessness. And we never really focus on that in the work on homelessness. We never look at like what's happening structurally, systemically, because as you said, we're so focused on the crises, working with how do we help people on the day to day? What's the funding allowing us to do or guiding us to do? And so these conditions, the promotion of market capitalism, the promotion of individualism, widespread deregulation, the private sector push in housing that's happened, I think even more in Canada than the US,
Yes.
rather than public sector housing.
Yeah.
All of that's had profound impacts that never get really looked at.
Absolutely. I talk to my students and I talk to people about, the crisis that we're in 2026 Canada is 30 plus years in the making. And so yet the solutions that, again, I think homelessness serving agencies have to show to get those donations is that we've got a quick fix, that we promise we'll fix it because that's how neighbors will donate. But there is no way an individual organization on their own can fix it and that it can be fixed quickly because it's going to take years of policy change to undo what we've done. I also think it's hopeful, actually, in my mind, that we can see the policy decisions that created this crisis, which means that the homelessness crisis that we're in right now is not natural. It's not innate. It's not definitely have to be. If policies created it, policies can undo it too. So I actually see that as a sign of hope that we can fix this. We just have to have the will to do it.
Yeah, I'm teaching a class this semester, and the overriding message is this is not just the way things are. This isn't the way they have to be. We can undo this if we want, if we have the will, if we have desire, and we figure out the creativity to figure out how to do that. So going back to the prevention question, I really like how you talked about that. It's really been a shift that's such a diversity of people now who are homeless and becoming homeless. So doing prevention work becomes much more complicated, and doing sort of the intervening and how do we even help people once they become homeless. So in the US, I think there's a couple groups that get really underexplored. There's a lack of attention on LGBTQ youth, Indigenous youth, African Americans, youth from poor families. Is this situation similar in Canada?
I think we have some really great national organizations that have shed light on the youth homelessness crisis and have really positioned the work as if we invest in preventing youth homelessness, that's going to prevent adult homelessness, because we know that many adults who are experiencing chronic homelessness had their first experience usually under the age of 16. So I think there has been really great work in Canada around youth homelessness, but absolutely with the other pieces. I think one of the biggest struggles we have around prevention is, as I mentioned, first of all, it's not the homelessness sector. Again, if we're doing prevention well, it's not the homelessness sector that's actually going to be doing that work. If they've gotten to the homelessness bit, then we're already too late. Then, we can do some early intervention stuff, which is great, but we actually should be moving further upstream and preventing it early on. So how do we get other institutions on board? How do we get schools and hospitals and the employment sector and things like that? How do we get them to see their role in homelessness prevention? I think that's one of the tricky bits. The other tricky bit, and this is true of all kinds of prevention, not only homelessness prevention, is how do you make the case for investing in prevention when you have to demonstrate that something didn't happen? That's a really hard one for investors to wrap their heads around, to say, well, it's because of this program that so many people didn't become homeless. That's just a hard one from an evaluation perspective. And that seems like a hurdle that should be easy enough to jump through. But again, as part of that homelessness industrial complex, the evaluation mechanisms that we use on organizations, what they have to prove to keep their doors open, often is not aligned with, for example, prevention or housing stability, right? Keeping people who have been homeless, keeping them stably housed once they have found housing.
But I would argue that for decades now, we've been making these arguments to the public, to funders, to donors, that if you give to us, we'll, in the shelters, except the sheltering industry, we'll fix these people, fix what's wrong with them. Maybe it's teaching them to be responsible. Maybe it's intervening with mental health or drug abuse, or maybe it's they just need to learn how to budget their money better or something. And the evidence is clear that that doesn't reduce homelessness. So wouldn't the evaluation of that show that we need a different strategy rather than doing the same tried and failed strategy over and over again for decades?
Yeah, it really just shows that it's not about facts and it's not about evidence. We have a narrative. We just have a broad social narrative that it must be an individual's fault. And I think it's a protective narrative. I think as housed people bear witness to the true trauma and distress of what it means to experience homelessness, I think it's a self-preservation thing that we need to believe it's their fault, because if it's not, that means we're complicit in the system that has allowed that kind of suffering to take place. So I think we have to work towards, and that's what the kind of new research I'm starting to look at, is how do we get people to a place where they can empathize, where they can take on that message, and then hopefully do something about it. Do something as in vote for the kinds of political leaders that will make that kind of substantive change, or actually do some of the work themselves.
Here in the U.S., it's hard to find anybody to vote for, though. It's a problem.
Listen, as it was coming out of my mouth, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to get into it. But yes, yeah.
So let's move on to some of that new work too. So for a while you were writing about, and there was NIMBY was a title in a lot of your articles, the NIMBY response to homeless people. And certainly there are lots of people who've become frustrated with public homelessness, with camping, with visible homelessness. All too often this results in sort of a push for criminalizing, because they're thinking, well, can we just clear this up so I can be safe for my community, et cetera? You've done a bunch of research on this, but recently you've begun to critically interrogate this sense that it's so simple as NIMBY, right? Then I'm thinking about this Invisibility Project, your Bridging Divides documentary, really work to complicate this concept NIMBY. So what's wrong with NIMBY?
I think you would actually be a perfect person to answer that own question, because you've done some really good critical work on. I'm just following in your footsteps my whole career. So whatever you do next, you let me know, and I'll just do it, 10 years after you.
No, you've been doing much better work than me for the last 20 years. So.
But so anyways, you had the answer before I ever did. When I started doing this NIMBY work about six years ago, I was like, NIMBYs are bad. They hate people who are homeless. They are discompassionate, all these things. And as I came to do this work, which is true of academia so often, everything is gray. There's no black and white. And how silly I was to think that there is black and white. There are absolutely, in my own community and across the country in North America, there are people who truly have taken up the homeless population to be weaponized, and absolutely do espouse hate. And we've seen, in the communities that I was studying, violence towards people who are homeless. So that absolutely happens. But the vast majority, I've come to learn, is the vast majority of people who are labeled NIMBY have concerns, sometimes, legitimate, sometimes maybe, I would say less legitimate, but are feeling fear, are feeling discomfort. And then, similar to what I was talking about before, putting that defense mechanism up, they hear the term NIMBY, and understandably, the wall goes up. And so I very rarely now use the term NIMBY, because I recognize that it's not helpful for most people who, again, often do have valid concerns. Some of the concerns we hear are around safety, are around disruptions happening. And that's, part of the documentary was, business owners talking about, people won't come into my store if they have to step over somebody who's homeless, and I need to keep my business running. I think that's a valid concern. And I don't think it means that they hate unhoused people because they have that concern. At the same time, other NIMBY or NIMBY labeled concerns we hear are things like, that supportive housing building will ruin the community aesthetic. And I don't have a lot of patience for community aesthetic as a reason not to build housing for low-income people. So, but yes, all in all, what I have come to learn is people on all lines of perspectives on this issue want to be heard. And what we found in the documentary is, except for those outliers, except for those, people who are truly hateful, more people than we think have common values, agree more than they might have realized. And if we can latch onto those pieces that they agree on, we don't want homelessness in our community. Okay, well, how do we help that? Calling the police probably isn't going to help it. It's probably going to make it worse. What can we do that will help both the unhoused people themselves and the community who doesn't want to see homelessness either?
So your documentary film, can you talk a little bit about that? Because this was about that, trying to bring people together and get different voices and raise these voices. Right? And also just a little bit about why use film.
So I give almost all my credit to my co-researcher, Carrie Sanders, who I would have given up multiple times making a documentary, but she's persistent, and making a documentary is hard. She kept us going. So We used what we called a broker dialogue methodology, which is brokering a dialogue. We, the researchers, are the intermediaries between people who might not normally speak to one another, right? So in the documentary, we speak to somebody who is homeless, somebody who's precariously housed, a service provider, a business owner, small business owner, and a member of law enforcement. And we made sure that it was us who they were talking to because, for example, somebody who's homeless probably doesn't want to speak to, and actually in this case didn't want to speak to a member of law enforcement, and wanting to make sure that's safe. So the broker dialogue methodology has us do the interviews with them, filmed. They watch each other's conversations and then they respond back to each other, again filmed by us, so that the conversation happens through us in a safe way. This broker dialogue methodology was modeled off another broker dialogue video that I saw by Alex Abramovich, who is an incredible researcher here in Canada who does research on this LGBTQ plus youth experiencing homelessness. So I saw his documentary and wanted to replicate it when we were talking about these misperceptions, especially in mid-sized cities. So we've seen mid-sized cities really going through it during and post-COVID around visible homelessness. So we wanted to create a documentary so that people could speak to each other and see again that there probably is more alignment than they realize. That actually wasn't our goal at the outset. We didn't think there'd be as much alignment as there was. That came because when you get into it with people, when you have moved beyond the initial response was like, ooh, I don't want to see that, or ooh, just get rid of it. When you dig a bit deeper, turns out people are more understanding and do have more nuance there than we might have thought. So not only did we create that documentary, but then we did community screenings in the 3 cities that we did the research in. So in total, there was probably 500 people who came to those documentary screenings. And then we've been taking it on the road, so to speak. So we've been able to show it in cities mostly across Canada. We also went to Santiago, Chile to show it, really hoping that the dialogue that you see in the documentary doesn't stop in the documentary. It's actually the beginning of more dialogue. So you'll see on the YouTube page where the documentary is free for anybody to access if they Google Bridging Divides, Voices and Visions on Homelessness in Mid-Sized Cities. We created like a book club list of questions so that people can hold their own screenings and have their own conversations with their community.
I'm going to put the link to the film in the comments so people can go to that.
Thank you.
It just makes me think, well, first, I like that you're doing it in the mid-sized cities because that gets too little attention, I think. And so I think that's the case. But it reminds me of this line Stuart Hall had years ago in his book, The Hard Road to Renewal, where he talks about researchers. And he says, too often researchers on the left do research to find evidence to support what they think they already know. And the point of doing research is to learn.
Absolutely.
Right? So we should be open to being surprised, to learn, to think differently. But it also makes me think of this project going on, right? Couple cities away from me, Lansing, Michigan, another mid-sized city of about a little bit less than 100,000 people.
Okay.
They're trying to create this mod pod community, these little sort of tiny houses, but they're not really houses, they're pods. And there was a whole series of meetings and discussions this fall about where to locate them. And they had all these community meetings, and it was just fascinating. Almost everybody. So I went to a bunch of these meetings, look at the comments when the discussions online. It's all, this is a great idea. I just don't want it next to
But
me.
not mine. That's right.
Right?
That's right.
But you can understand it. It's people have a fear, especially in a city like Lansing. If you have a home, people are so economically precarious. This is the only valuable thing that you have. You don't want to risk that. And then they came up with 5 initial sites. One school that had been closed for a couple of years, parks, public parks. And people are like, you're going to take, you've been closing parks and privatizing them as it is. This is the only good thing we have in our neighborhood is the parks. And you're going to take that space away from us? And so there was this pushback against it. And you could see this as an NIMBY response. But people were really clear that they thought that they're not against homeless people. They just want their lives to be okay too. And so it eventually came up with another space on a municipal building parking lot where they're going to be locating this instead, or at least if they get permission to do it. But that's the plan. But it was fascinating because the easy response is, well, look at all these selfish people. They don't want this. But if you dig further, everybody was like, we're not against homeless people. We're just against our lives being disrupted even more.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. The first thought is there was a couple of years ago, and I only followed this in the news. I'm not intimately connected with it, but there was a community in Alberta, Canada, that they were suggesting of opening a shelter, and it was in an industrial zone. It was like on the gravel pit in an industrial zone. And the pushback from community, and they use the idea of community aesthetics here, was so intense. And that was my aha moment that it actually doesn't matter where it is. The fact that, a quote unquote NIMBY response will happen when it's going to be suggested in an industrial zone, it means there is truly no place for people who are homeless, that you can keep pushing it further and further into the margins or further out of the city, and people will still have a problem with it. So there's that piece of it, that no matter what, there's going to be this pushback, and that there is no, as long as it's not in this community, there's no community or neighborhood where it can exist. So I think that's important. But then on the other side, and again, you've written so beautifully about this as well, is in a lot of the communities that I've spent time in, where these services or whatever it is are being suggested are in neighborhoods that are already maybe precarious themselves or low income themselves, that wealthier neighborhoods are able to mobilize and advocate, are more politically attuned to how to stop those things than the lower income neighborhoods, where they might not have the time to be going to community delegations and things like that. And so I'm a bit of two minds of it, because I recognize that some communities or some neighborhoods are overwhelmed with those resources, and we're not spreading it fairly among the neighborhoods, and there's a class piece to that I think is really important to pay attention to. At the same time, I'm also aware that if we spread it all out, folks who are homeless who need to get to different services and support, it doesn't kind of need to be in one location too. So I struggle with that, but I recognize that it's not as easy as when it's those, again, more low income neighborhoods that are the ones that are pushing back when they've borne the brunt of what those services look like.
No, that's a struggle happening in other places. People need all the services to be within an accessible area.
When I teach a class on the criminalization of homelessness, and the first week I always tell my students, if you think you're leaving this class with answers, I got news for you. I mean, it's often leave with more questions. If I knew the answer to so many of these complicated questions, I would have sold it for free. I would have given it away for free and solved homelessness by now. It's really, really challenging. But I think one of the biggest challenges, and that's what I've learned around the NIMBYism research, is that we're not very good on all sides, not very good about having those conversations together, and not very good about having those dialogues. If we did, I think we'd be in a much better place. So if we could, organizations can't be honest about here's what I can do and here's what we can't fix. I mean, they just can't do that because, again, funding, fundraising initiatives, things like that won't allow for that kind of honesty and candidness that I actually think would be very refreshing, and I think we need as a community.
And how do your students like that idea that you're not going to give them the answer?
I think they're okay with it by fourth year seminar. I've been really lucky. This class is my baby, and I got to design it and create it. And whenever I have my hopeless days, which we all do, we all have moments where it feels like, why even bother, where things seem to be going backwards instead of forwards. Every semester, and I actually had it yesterday because I taught yesterday, a student will say in passing, they don't even realize how important it is, oh, I used to think such and such stereotype about people who are homeless, and now because of this course I don't think that anymore. And so somebody said it in passing yesterday, and I was like, you're about to make me cry, and you don't even know. They don't realize the value of it. So I do believe, and this is where I can see that things can change and minds can change, and just some awareness. It's a 12-week class. It's actually not a ton of time. Can get people to think dramatically differently about the crisis when they know more. And so if that can happen in my little seminar class of 30 students, it can happen on a grander scale. I really believe that.
I just shared research on the growing number of elderly homeless people.
Yeah.
And the students were shocked. And that was the response. They were like, wow, I never even considered that. I couldn't imagine that was the case.
Yeah. There are some shelters in Canada that have opened exclusively for older adults because so many older adults are experiencing homelessness for the first time in their
Right.
50s and 60s. And so they're too scared, understandably, they're too scared to go into what we think of as like the typical homeless shelter. And so they're designing these shelters, yeah, for seniors. And that's just heartbreaking that that's our answer for older adults. Absolutely.
So another collaborative research project you've been working on, the Loneliness Project, which you just pointed out to me and I find really interesting and useful. This brings attention to the impacts of loneliness on homelessness, especially for young women, gender diverse people. So let me try to summarize quickly. Young women and gender diverse people who are homeless or exiting homelessness will point out how stress, loneliness, isolation, lack of connections makes exiting more difficult, a lot more difficult. Is that kind of adequate? Is that what you've been finding?
Absolutely. Thank you for letting me talk about this because I'm so proud of this work. And this was really collaborative with an incredible team of lived expert researchers. So I do want to give a shout out to Charlotte and Holly and Shinwei, who led a big chunk of the research itself. And the work couldn't have been done without them. And so it was in collaboration with them. And we worked as a team to really get at this idea that housing isn't enough. We talk about housing as a crucial, and of course it is, we need housing for people. But I think so much of the work that's been happening over the last 2 decades has been putting a roof over people's heads and then kind of walking away because there isn't enough resources or capacity left to support people once they're housed. And I initially conceived of that research project thinking about older adults, as we were just talking about, older adults being lonely and isolated, and then doing a little bit of research, especially COVID hit right after I got the grant. And it turns out it's young people and young women in particular who are the loneliest generation.
Right.
And that's based on primarily US statistics. So that's where things really shifted to understand what's happening with young women there. And again, we saw things around safety and young women and gender diverse youth talking about how, one described having to crawl out the window to go grocery shopping because there's creepy guys in her hallway that will harass her. So she stays isolated in her unit. Young parents who feel like they can't go to these community groups or youth events because they have a little one in tow and they don't feel welcome, being in those spaces. We ended up getting almost half of the people that we spoke with were racialized and talking about how so many of the workers that they are connected with don't look like them and don't understand them. And so one of the biggest takeaways from that research is, again, huge shout out to the homelessness sector for creating youth drop-in events and art events. And those are wonderful things. But actually with the people that we spoke with, they wanted to be connected to their own kind of community. So, one was a skateboarder and really wanted to be connected with other skateboarders. A bunch of them, again, were newcomers to Canada, so wanted to be connected to people from their country of origin, from their culture, from their religion. And so it really demonstrated how we as a society need to be welcoming in a variety of ways to people who might look different than us or have different experiences than us, because that's actually the community that will fulfill them and will make them feel connected in the long term and will ultimately keep their housing stable.
When I spoke with Juha Kahila from the Y Foundation in Finland, he discussed how so much of what they do is thinking about the housing that they put people into and that they make available for people, and that you need a whole variety of housing options for people. And a lot of them with space that give people a place to be with others, to make connections with others, and to have something to do. And it made me think we don't do anything like that here. And so often we think it's a success if we get somebody into a space, but we don't create a home for them. We don't think of that as a home. And it makes the work, it's a lot easier just to put somebody into some room somewhere. That we can do. But actually undoing some of the other damages and making it so people feel connected again, that's going to be a lot more challenging.
That goes back to the evaluation piece. Again, what metrics get measured? It's how many people you put in a unit, which again is really important. But that idea around sense of well-being and sense of connection is really hard to measure. So it's hard to give funding, for those pieces. A researcher here in Ontario, Canada, named Carrie-Anne Marshall has done fabulous work on boredom amongst people transitioning from homelessness to housing. And it's so important. People need a reason to get up in the morning. We all do. And if we end up isolating folks in these units that we're providing, that's really not sustainable. And I've seen it in the people I've connected with over and over, people who had housing, pretty good housing, but kept coming back to the homeless serving spaces because they were so abjectly lonely. And so one of the key messages from that loneliness project was the connection to belonging, making sure people are part of a community, feeling of well-being isn't a nice to have. It's not a bonus on top of providing housing. If we want all that hard work that folks have done to get housing in the first place, if we want it to stick, we actually need to prioritize those other pieces as well.
Right. And for so long, it was like, if the person comes back, oh, there's something wrong, right?
Mhm.
But we need to acknowledge that, people want connections. If they're in a place where they feel a sense of belonging and community, and then we get some housing, but they're lonely and isolated there, and they're bored all day. That was the other thing he said that the Y Foundation does, is that in a lot of their housing that they have what he call low entry work on the
Oh,
bottom
yeah.
floor. So people have something to do, and they can make a little bit of money, but not the money so much. It's you can go downstairs and you can work with other people, and you can talk to them, and you spend time together, and you can make these connections with each other. And so many people are so isolated, and it's not just unhoused people, right? The former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy described an epidemic of loneliness in the U.S. and describes how this has profound negative effects, long-term effects on people's emotional and physical health. And we have to think about, why is it that people feel so lonely? Why is it, how do you describe the loneliness generation, right?
Yeah.
What's creating this? What can we do if we want to actually solve these issues? We need to acknowledge that they're issues to begin with, and then take it seriously. What's
Yeah.
created all this loneliness among people?
I mean, I think it actually goes back to the beginning of our conversation when we talked about the invoking neoliberalism as our dominating ideology. If we are designing our society that is every individual out for themselves, that's going to have a ripple effect on how we just interact with each other and how we communicate and interact with one another. And so I know the UK and in Japan both created, in the UK it was a minister of loneliness. So at a high government level said, like, this is actually, again, it's going to cost us healthcare dollars. It's going to cost us social and economic ramifications of people feeling this lonely. This isn't, again, I feel like people dismiss this as, I don't know, not important or not as important as other things, but actually it's vital. It's vital to who we are as human beings. And so, yeah, I think it goes back to neoliberalism. And so if we can fight against the, solely individualistic way of thinking about ourselves and thinking about the community that we live in and work in and play in, that I think we'll be a lot better off.
Well, a key part of neoliberalism was getting rid of anything that's collective
That's
or
right.
and public, and push private. There's so much research, even things, public parks, public pools, the places where people would come together, um,
Exactly.
just don't exist anymore. Those have been sort of dismantled in favor of private.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
and then there's so many other things, right?
I resisted putting up when my daughter was young, I resisted putting up a play structure in our backyard. It would have been easy. I could have just let her in the backyard. But I was like, no, that's what parks are for. And we go to the park and you can play on the play structure at the park. And we don't need our own individual playground in our own backyards. We can come together as a community to play together.
Well, we live 5 houses up the street from a elementary school, and with a beautiful playground in the back. And my kids would go down there when they was young, and we'd go to play on the play structures there, and they'd be playing by themselves most of the time,
Yeah.
unless we invited somebody else to go.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot, it's too dangerous to go out in public.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But or you look at like Yoni Sparks' work when he talks
Hmm.
about the people in 10 City 3 living in a tent in Seattle on a platform is not the most fun thing to do. What they liked is the community and the connection. And he talks about that you could create a home, and a home is not just a space, a physical space to live in, but a place where you have connections with other people. And how do we return to that becomes sort of the challenge. Or it sort of makes me think about, you know, Julia Christensen's work, when she talks about spiritual homelessness
Yes.
and, when Indigenous people. And I think we could extend that. What this periods of colonialism, of neoliberal capitalism has done to human beings, to to isolate us, to individualize us. So we've done in this quest for economic growth and vast wealth for a few people. What have we done to ourselves? And how do we begin to take those concerns seriously? Right? How do we create societies where people's humanity becomes prioritized again? People truly have homes with connections with one another that help humans thrive fully, not live through trauma, not try to survive trauma, um, and rather than being homeless. How do we, that I'm not expecting you to answer that
Yeah.
one, but shouldn't that be a goal?
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think you're absolutely right. And if I've learned anything in all my years, it's that we have so much to learn from Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge, and they're so giving and so welcoming to share their learnings and share their teachings with us settlers. And it's up to us to listen and reciprocate and give back like land.
So one last related question. This is an easy one for you. So you have structural systemic inequities, dislocate people, disrupt potentials into lives, produce vast insecurities, inequalities that result in homelessness. In this powerful rhetorical shift, the intervention gaze becomes fixed on repairing or reforming, governing individualized people rather than the systems and structures of inequality. How do we push back against that? If we hope to end homelessness, what's needed? How's the work you're doing now? Is it that you're doing now? How does that connect? How are you trying to address these type of issues?
Yeah, just a lob question at the end there, eh?
Yeah,
Uh,
that's reason.
I think there's a few things. So I think, as we've already talked about, and I really borrow here from Stephen Gates, who is the president and CEO of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, where I did all my prevention work. He talks about how we have focused, and I think that, the Homelessness Industrial Complex is about focusing on those emergency responses. And we need to still have some emergency responses, but focus on that prevention piece and, housing first, and making sure people who have been, who are chronically homeless are able to access and stay stably housed. I feel like the housing first principles and programming is eroding here in Canada in a really problematic way. So we can't take for granted even that side of it, and we need to work on prevention. So I think that's part of it. If we can shift those focus, shift our funding, shift our energy in those ways, I think that will be part of it. What I'm seeing myself do in the work I'm doing is, part of what I said that homelessness industrial complex includes the kinds of messaging that homeless serving agencies are able to give out into the world, the kind of fundraising or key messages that they're putting out there. What I'm trying to understand and then hopefully change is, what is the barrier to being able to have those candid, honest conversations in community, to be able to speak, to break down some of the stereotypes about homelessness so that we can actually work on the root causes of homelessness. And what do we need to do to get housed members of the public, many of whom maybe, haven't experienced homelessness, don't know anybody who's homeless. How do we get them on board to be able to accept those messages and those bigger concrete structural changes and actually champion them? I'm just going for accept right now. Then we can work on them
Right.
championing them. A lot of the work I've been doing is about, people will say to me often, we need politicians, whether it's city councilors all the way up to, higher levels of government. We need them to be bold and brave and make these hard political decisions. And I absolutely agree with that. At the same time, politicians will do what will get them votes. If being incredibly compassionate and progressive towards homelessness was going to secure them a win, they will do it. So I actually kind of put it back on us, the voting members of society, to call on our politicians to make good decisions. And that's essentially what I'm looking to do, is how do we change the narrative so that the public thinks about this and responds to it differently, and then in turn, I believe politicians will make different decisions.
Yeah, I think that that's so important. And it's so hard too, because as you said at the beginning here, the push is to tell us particular narratives so that you could get the money to keep doing the work that's needed to keep people alive, to keep people safe. But then that reinforces these problematic narratives, right?
Uh-huh.
And so how do we get the courage? And as you put it, the politicians' courage is only going to come when they see the votes, right? Because they have to be reelected. Or maybe we could just have a couple benevolent billionaires just donate money, and that'll solve the problem.
But I have a friend who was working in LA for a while, and there's money there to support homeless. It's not only the money, right? We need the
Right.
money and we need the like infrastructure and again, policies to change too. So money, absolutely, but even money on its own won't do it.
Right. If especially if you do more of the same type of work.
Exactly.
And I just think it's so funny when we talk about housing first, as though it's something that was actually put in place. Now it's
Yeah.
the little bit that was done is being dismantled. But I don't know any place where we actually fully embrace housing first approach. And to get that, to get the public will to have that as the goal, we need to sort of counter some of the narratives that people have.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, I was going to just say that the first mid-sized city where we did this NIMBY research, that was the dominant narrative was that housing first doesn't work. This is a waste, and really a strong distrust in what the government was doing around housing first because they didn't believe in it. But our understanding was the housing first that was implemented in that community, like lots of communities, is not in fidelity with the model. Again, it's the housing. They work so hard on getting the housing and it's so expensive that there isn't money and capacity left over for the wraparound supports that are supposed to come with housing first. And so it's frustrating to hear such negative ideas about housing first when actually what they were critiquing was never housing first.
Right. And this is why I applaud this. You moved to, despite the hard work, to make a documentary. Because it's one thing to have dialogue between you and I, or,
Yeah.
I can talk to Stephen Getz,
Yeah.
talk to Chris Herring, but what good does that do us? Or, read each other's articles and we could critique each other a little bit. But what we need to do is figure out a way to engage in dialogue with the other 300 million people somehow, right? And I think
Absolutely.
we need to have creative ways to do that. And it's hard for us to think about. It's so easy to write another academic paper,
Yeah.
but it's hard to be creative and try to think, how do we do something a bit different?
Yeah.
I thought about doing this podcast for like 4 years before I finally said, am I going to do it or not? And is it, do I think it's important to take a risk to try something new and see if I could engage in dialogue with more people beyond just
Absolutely.
my little inner circle there, right? It takes a risk to make a documentary film, do filmmaking, some way of engaging a broader audience of people, reaching more people.
Absolutely.
How do we begin to do that? Because I think there's people out there who are interested in learning more and care. And so I think it's up to us to try to figure out how to reach them. And that's why I think doing things like this film is really important. Now we just need to get, you know, more people to see it.
Eyeballs on it. Absolutely. Yeah. I feel very comfortable talking to you and preaching to the choir, so to speak. I feel doing this and doing the community screenings. And as we've again, taken the show on the road in ways, it's intimidating. And I have worried a lot. And yet I realize that I'm not going to get anywhere preaching to the choir. We're only going to get somewhere if we talk to people who don't necessarily agree with us. And really a lot of this work came out of a lot of reflection and internal thinking I had to do, during Black Lives Matter. And at the heart of that, I thought, well, who am I as a researcher? What am I doing? How am I engaging with this as a white middle class researcher? And I realized my people, quote unquote, are the NIMBYs. I mean, it's the white middle class folk, So I said, well, where can my research be the most helpful and the most beneficial? It would be talking to, again, quote unquote, my people. And so that's what's really driven me is I believe that lived experts should be doing most of this work. So what's the piece that I can take on that lived experts shouldn't have to? It's the talking with the people who, might seem like they hate them or might be espousing, unhelpful stereotypes. So that's the work that I've taken on.
Right. It's what I've always thought is we need to work on homelessness, not on homeless people.
Yeah.
And if the focus is so much on just homeless people, it misses the broader dynamics of the broad social conditions creating homelessness and making homelessness be acceptable. There's no reason for it to be. But I promised you 45 minutes. It's been an hour, so we should probably wrap up. As I said at the start, I wish we had 2 or 3 hours to talk about so much more of your work and get into it more adequately. But thank you so much. It's really important, really interesting work. I hope you continue to do this, engaging with the middle class public, and we begin to make a shift. This doesn't have to be what we have. We've made this. We can unmake it. We can make something new. We can make something better. We can make a better world. We have to imagine that that's possible and act towards it, right? So I hope the listeners take this as an opportunity to more fully explore your body of work, and I hope you have the resilience to keep up doing this work. I don't know how you do it, but
It's the lived experts. Honestly, it's those who like wouldn't let me stop. Like they help me to continue to do the hard work. So I'm so indebted to them.
so thanks so much. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.